The Pez Dispenser may have already told us how Juliette's family got into Silo 18. Season 2 gave us a strange little flashback. Daniel Keene, still living in the before times, gave Helen Drew a duck-shaped Pez dispenser after one of their dates. At the time, it looked like a fun little connection between two timelines. Then, we remembered where that exact object ended up. George had the Pez dispenser centuries later. He eventually gave it to Juliette. And by season 3, the show has made it clear that relics can carry much more meaning than the people inside the silo realize. That creates a very specific possibility. What if Daniel and Helen didn't simply help create the silo world? What if they actually became part of it? And what if Juliette Nichols is their descendant? Season 3 has given us enough clues that I think this theory deserves a much closer look. The biggest clue is obviously the Pez dispenser. The show went out of its way to establish that Daniel gave this object to Helen. We already knew it existed in Juliette's timeline, so the question was always how it survived for centuries. Now we have an even bigger problem. If Helen eventually entered the silo system, that would explain why an object that belonged to her somehow ended up inside Silo 18. There are several ways that could happen. Helen could have brought it with her. Someone could have taken it from her. It could have passed through several generations before arriving with George. But the more Season 3 tells us about relics, the harder it becomes to treat that connection as random. Physical objects have become one of the show's ways of connecting erased history to people living centuries later. That matters because Helen herself has a reason to care about preserving the past. She is a journalist. Her entire character is built around questioning official stories. She keeps digging when people tell her to stop. She refuses to accept convenient explanations. And now she's been given a front row seat to the secret project that will eventually create the world Juliette lives in. That is almost the perfect setup for someone who could become part of the resistance to historical erasure. Remember what relics mean inside Silo 18. People have been taught that the before times are dangerous. Objects from that period are controlled. Information about the old world is restricted. The entire society has been built around limiting people's ability to reconstruct what came before. Yet some objects survive, and some people seem unusually capable of questioning the story they've been given. Juliette is one of those people. That is where the theory gets much more interesting. Juliette's personality has always felt unusually compatible with Helen's. Juliette is stubborn. Helen is stubborn. Both of them become obsessed with questions that everyone else has learned to ignore. When Juliette discovers something that doesn't make sense, she can't simply accept the official explanation. Helen behaves the same way in the before times. That alone proves nothing. Plenty of characters can share personality traits. But then there is Daniel. Daniel's connection to Juliette is potentially even stronger. He is an engineer by background, and Juliette is one of the most technically capable people in Silo 18. She understands machines intuitively. She notices physical details that other people miss. When everyone else is arguing about rules and politics, Juliette is often looking at how something actually works. Daniel has already been positioned as someone with the technical knowledge needed to understand the Silo project. So, if Helen contributes the instinct to question authority, while Daniel contributes the engineering side, Juliette could represent a combination of both. Again, that isn't proof of a family connection, but Silo has spent 3 seasons making the past and present echo each other. And there is another detail that makes this theory harder to ignore. The rosemary. Rosemary has already been associated with memory, remembrance, and the preservation of what came before. That fits directly into one of the biggest ideas of Season 3. Memory can be manipulated. People can lose knowledge of their own history. The silo system depends on controlling that history. Yet certain objects and experiences can help people recover pieces of what was erased. That makes the relics more than old junk. They become evidence that someone from the before times was there. And if Helen became one of those people, she could have played a much larger role in the early silo population than we've been shown. There is also a really interesting possibility involving the Flamekeepers. We've already learned that certain people inside the silos have worked to preserve knowledge of the old world. They kept information alive when the official system wanted it forgotten. George was connected to that tradition, and George eventually possessed Helen's Pez dispenser. That creates a potential chain. Helen has the relic survives. It eventually reaches George. George becomes connected to Juliette, and Juliette becomes the person who starts tearing apart the system that erased the past. That would give the Pez dispenser an entirely different meaning. It wouldn't simply be an object that survived. It would be a physical trace of Juliette's own ancestry. And there is one more reason I think the timing matters. Daniel and Helen have now refused Stensen's offer. Episode 8 makes that decision very clear. They learn what the Silo Project is supposed to protect humanity from, they understand the scale of what Stensen is building, and they still refuse to join him. That creates a major unresolved problem. If Daniel and Helen are going to become part of Juliette's family history, how do they get from here to there? Because they aren't volunteering, they are leaving. And Stensen has every reason to make sure they don't walk away with everything they've learned. That could be the turning point. Their refusal may be exactly what forces their lives onto a different path. Maybe they are eventually captured. Maybe they discover another way into the project. Maybe they become involved with the people who are being prepared for life underground. Or maybe Helen's investigation leads her somewhere Stensen never intended her to go. There is also the possibility that they don't enter the silos immediately. That may actually make the theory stronger. The silo system won't simply appear overnight with thousands of people suddenly living underground. There has to be a transition. There has to be a period when people are selected, prepared, transported, and separated from the world they knew. Daniel and Helen could be caught somewhere inside that process. And if they survive long enough to have children inside that new society, their descendants could eventually become part of Silo 18. That would explain why the show introduced them as a couple in the first place. Their relationship would have a purpose beyond giving us the origin of the Pez dispenser. The writers may be building the beginning of a family line. And that brings us back to Juliette. If Juliette really is descended from Daniel and Helen, there is a bigger question. Why would the writers hide that connection for so long? Because the reveal would fit one of the show's biggest themes. Juliette has spent her entire life inside a system designed to make people forget who they were. Her family history is already fragmented. The silos records are incomplete. Relics have been separated from their original meaning, and memories themselves can be manipulated. So imagine the irony if Juliette's own ancestry has been sitting in front of her the entire time. The Pez dispenser, the relics, the Flamekeeper tradition, the strange persistence of people who refuse to accept the official version of history. All of those things could lead back to one family. And there is an especially interesting detail about George. Before Juliette ever understood what was happening, George was already fascinated by the secrets underneath Silo 18. He wanted answers. He was willing to investigate things that other people considered dangerous. He also had access to relics and information that most residents would never encounter. That makes George look like another link in the chain. If Helen became one of the original people who preserved forbidden knowledge, her descendants could have inherited more than her DNA. They could have inherited a culture of questioning, a family habit, a willingness to keep asking why. And that is exactly what Juliette does. This could also explain why the show's Relic storyline feels so personal. Juliette has already encountered objects that should be meaningless to her. Yet, they repeatedly pull her toward questions about the past. The Pez dispenser is the most obvious example because we know exactly where it came from. That is extremely unusual for a show like Silo. The writers didn't simply introduce a random relic and later explain it. They showed us its origin hundreds of years earlier. Daniel gave it to Helen. Then it appeared in the Silo timeline. That is a deliberate bridge between two eras. The remaining question is, who carried it across that bridge? And Helen is the obvious candidate. There is a catch, though. The Pez dispenser alone cannot prove Helen is Juliette's ancestor. Someone else could have transported it. It could have passed through multiple unrelated families. Helen could have entered Silo 18 without having children there. The show has left plenty of room for another explanation. So, the strongest version of this theory needs more than one relic. That's where the other objects become important. If the rosemary branch and other before times objects are eventually shown to have direct connections to Helen, Daniel, or their descendants, the family theory becomes much stronger. The writers would effectively be leaving fingerprints across the timeline. One object points backward, another points forward. Eventually, all of them could converge on Juliette. And there is a really clean storytelling reason to do that. Juliette is currently fighting the same system that may have been created during Daniel and Helen's lifetime. She is trying to preserve information. Helen was trying to uncover information. Daniel was pulled into the machinery that would eventually create the silos. Their stories are already connected thematically. A biological connection would turn that thematic connection into an actual family history. It would also make Juliette's fight much more tragic. She wouldn't simply be rebelling against an institution created centuries ago. She would be confronting the system that swallowed her own ancestors. There is another possibility I can't ignore. Daniel and Helen may not be ordinary silo residents. If Stensen's project needs people with specific knowledge, skills, or psychological traits, Daniel and Helen could have been valuable candidates. Daniel understands engineering and government. Helen understands investigation, communication, and the political story surrounding the disaster. Those are useful abilities during the creation of a closed civilization. If they were eventually brought underground, they could have been involved in the earliest organization of the silos. And Daniel's technical background creates a particularly interesting possibility. Could he have helped establish some of the mechanical systems that later became part of Silo 18? Could Helen have helped preserve information that later became forbidden history? Could their descendants have remained connected to those roles for generations? That would give Juliette's engineering ability an even more interesting context. She would have inherited a technical tradition that began with Daniel. Meanwhile, the Flamekeeper tradition could preserve Helen's obsession with the truth. The two sides would eventually meet in Juliette. There is also a darker version of the theory. What if Daniel and Helen are separated? What if one of them enters the silos while the other remains outside? What if their descendants are scattered across different silos? That could explain why certain relics appear in different places and why some families seem to carry fragments of knowledge without understanding where they came from. The silo system was designed to isolate people. Family histories could have been deliberately broken apart. And if the algorithm knew that certain bloodlines were more likely to resist control, it might have had a reason to monitor or manipulate them. That would make Juliette's existence even more dangerous. She could represent a line of people who have been questioning the system since the very beginning. There is one thing I would watch very closely in the remaining episodes: the way the show handles Helen. If she enters Silo 18, even briefly, the theory becomes much harder to dismiss. If she is shown interacting with the relics, even better. And if the show gives us any indication that Helen has children or establishes a family connection that survives into the silo population, that could be the confirmation we've been waiting for. Daniel matters just as much. His technical knowledge has already been connected to the creation of the Silo project. If his story eventually intersects with the early mechanical department, that would create another direct line toward Juliette. For now, I would keep the theory at the level of a very strong possibility. The show has confirmed that Daniel gave Helen the Pez Dispenser. The Pez later existed inside Silo 18. Season 3 has established that relics can preserve connections to the erased past. Daniel and Helen have now rejected Stensen's offer, leaving their fate unresolved. And Juliette has repeatedly shown traits that would fit both of them. None of that confirms a family tree, but it does create a pattern. And Silo has always been a show where the smallest objects can carry the biggest clues. The really satisfying version of this theory would be for Juliette to eventually discover that the mystery she has been chasing through Silo 18 was already part of her family history. The Pez dispenser would have been there centuries before she was born. The relics would have survived when memories didn't. And the people who started asking questions in the before times could have passed that instinct all the way down to her. Daniel and Helen may have entered the silo world as strangers to Juliette. They could eventually turn out to be the reason she was always so determined to find the truth. And if that happens, Juliette's rebellion becomes more than the end of the silo's old order. It becomes the continuation of a question her family started asking generations earlier. What really happened to the world outside?